All right, let's dive into a real puzzle. We're talking about a continent so massive it could fit two entire Indias inside of it. And yet, most of it is completely, utterly empty. Today, we're going to figure out why.
I mean, seriously, look at it. It's the sixth largest country in the world. But if you look at a population map, it looks like a ghost town. So what is going on here? What's the real story behind all that empty space?
The number itself is just staggering. 95% of Australia is empty. That makes it one of the most sparsely populated nations on the entire planet. But believe it or not, that number doesn't even tell the whole story.
Because, get this, 90% of all Australians are squeezed into just 0.22% of the total land. Most of them are in just 5 cities right on the coast: Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide. The second you start to go inland, the people just disappear.
So why? Well, the answer isn't simple, and it doesn't start with geography, which is what you might think. No, it starts with a really painful and often hidden piece of history. To understand why Australia is empty today, you first have to understand how it was nearly emptied in the first place. So let's wind the clock back to the late 1700s. European ships are appearing on the horizon, approaching what they see as a brand new shore.
When the British landed in 1788, they made a declaration. They called the land Terra Nullius, a Latin phrase meaning nobody's land. Now, this was a convenient lie. The land wasn't empty at all. It was home to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who'd been there for tens of thousands of years. But with those two words, their very existence was legally erased, and the entire continent was claimed for Great Britain.
And here's the first big twist. The people who arrived weren't your typical settlers looking for a new life. They were prisoners. The whole point was to turn Australia into a giant open-air prison. Between 1788 and 1868, Britain shipped over 162,000 convicts there. This wasn't about peaceful settlement, it was about dumping Britain's unwanted population on the other side of the world.
But it wasn't just people in chains that came off those ships. It was something invisible and way, way deadlier: European diseases. The indigenous population had been isolated for millennia, so they had zero immunity. Smallpox, measles, whooping cough. These were invisible killers that just tore through communities with terrifying speed. And the impact was immediate and catastrophic. In the Sydney area, just within the first year, it's estimated that smallpox killed half, 50% of the indigenous population. And what's truly tragic is that the British had treatments and vaccines, but reports say they were withheld, leaving people to suffer and die.
And if you can believe it, disease was just the first wave. What came next was a brutal, violent, century-long fight for the land itself.
As the British pushed further inland, putting up fences, taking over water sources, and hunting grounds, conflict was, well, inevitable. Starting around 1795, a whole series of violent conflicts erupted, which we now call the Frontier Wars. This wasn't one single war. It was 100 years of fighting for survival. So, when you combine the diseases with the decades of war, you get a population collapse that is almost impossible to imagine. Before colonization, the population was somewhere around 750,000. By 1900, it was down to maybe 75,000. Some estimates say as low as 30,000. That's a drop of around 90%, an entire people almost wiped out.
You'd think that after all that horror, the 20th century would be a time for healing and rebuilding, right? Well, no. Instead, it brought new policies designed to keep the population down and engineer a very specific kind of nation.
First up, you had the World Wars. In World War I, Australia sent over 416,000 of its men to fight for Britain in Europe. 40% of them never came home. World War II brought even more losses. This absolutely devastated the country's male population and just slammed the brakes on any kind of population recovery.
And then came what was really the final blow. In 1901, the brand new country of Australia passed a law. Its unofficial name was the White Australia Policy, and it was designed to do exactly what it sounds like: keep the continent white and British by effectively banning all non-white immigration. This made sure that the population couldn't grow from the outside either.
So after all of that, the diseases, the wars, the racist policies, what's the legacy? Well, look at the numbers today. Native Australians now make up just 3.8% of the entire population. The very foundation of the country was shattered before it even had a chance to be built.
Okay, so that explains the dark history, how the continent was emptied out. But that was then. Populations can and do rebound. So why is Australia still so incredibly empty? To answer that, we have to shift from history to geography.
Because it turns out the history is only half the story. The other half is the land itself, a continent that, in many ways, just doesn't want to be lived on. You can basically break the continent down into 3 major zones. First, the Western Plateau. And this isn't just a desert, it's a colossal desert that covers 2/3 of the entire country. It is, for all intents and purposes, uninhabitable. Then you have the Central Lowlands. This part is flat, yeah, but its rivers and its soil are incredibly salty. That makes the water undrinkable and the land pretty useful for farming. So that leaves just one area, the Eastern Highlands, that relatively thin, fertile strip along the coast where basically everyone lives.
And even in that tiny, livable strip, it's not exactly paradise. Because a whopping 70% of the country is arid, it's constantly at risk of horrible droughts. Where you do find water, it's often too salty to use. And that beautiful eastern coast where everyone lives, well, because of its location, it gets slammed by 2 or 3 destructive cyclones every single year.
So, when you finally bring these two massive forces together, a truly brutal history and a deeply hostile geography, the picture of this huge empty continent starts to make a whole lot of sense. It really all comes down to this. First, the foundation of the country, its original population, was almost entirely wiped out. Then, a century of war and discriminatory policies made sure it couldn't recover or grow. And on top of all that, the land itself is overwhelmingly hostile. Most of it is desert, and the small part that is livable is constantly battered by extreme weather. It's just the perfect storm of history and geography. You see, Australia isn't empty by some random accident. It's the direct result of a tragic human story layered on top of a brutal, unforgiving landscape. And that leaves you with a final thought, doesn't it? If this is the story of Australia, what other hidden stories are out there, waiting to be found in the other vast, empty spaces on our maps?